So let's have a look at a way for us to actually style information in our HTML pages. To do that, we're going to use cascading style sheets, or often that's the acronym we see. The acronym for that is CSS. So let's talk about what it is and how we actually use it. So let's imagine we start off with a document, and let's look at the semantic HTML for that. So this is a very plain thing. It's basically just got a collection of headings, an H1 and H2, a paragraph. There's an image, we've got another H2 and then another paragraph, something like that. Well, let's imagine that we make it colourful in some very poor HTML engine or piece of software. So it looks like this. And what we'd end up with is a really fragmented, badly structured source for the document that looks like this. Now, if you look closely into the HTML, you should be able to see that the content is in there somewhere, but that it's absolutely mangled in with presentation elements like font color and things like that. What's actually happened is we've sort of lost the content, which you can see in blue here. So here I'm just highlighting what I would argue would be the actual content of the page, the headings, the paragraph, those other aspects that make up the actual content, and that's been mangled in with the style or the design, and you can see that here in green. And historically, that's the way the web was moving forward before CSS. Lots and lots of presentational design and style elements were being added into HTML so that we could achieve nice layouts. But as you can see, what that does is that mangles up the design and the structure. Now, of course, the problem with that was what happened when we wanted to use that same content in lots of different ways. Now, what that actually translates into is that we might want to take that content and present it in a different style depending upon the device that we're actually using. So, if we were going to print it out, maybe it would be printed out in black and white, and there would be headers and footers, and we'd have a slightly different style, structure, page numbers, and that would be very different to the style that we'd use if we displayed it on a mobile device or something with a smaller screen. There's also the possibility that we could have people who are viewing the site who have visual impairments, so they could actually have special browsers that read the text aloud or enlarge the text, discard pictures. And of course, for those, reading that mangled HTML code aloud is going to be very difficult indeed. So the solution then is to actually separate the content out from the design. And for this, the obvious technique that we're going to use, and the obvious technique that has been used, is we'll have semantic HTML, sort of meaningful HTML for our content, and we use cascading style sheets for our design. So the way that this works in practice is you have the content in a particular file, and as you can see, here's our semantic HTML, sort of meaningful HTML, no presentational elements in there. And then we combine it with a second file, which is our style sheet. And this is what a style sheet looks like, and I'll explain what the actual ins and outs of the actual layout means later on. But for the moment, you can see we've got one file, which is the HTML, one file, which is the CSS. And those are combined to create our final transformed document. So we have the HTML combined with our design, which transforms into our final display design. Now, of course, what's nice about that is we could replace the style sheet and end up with a completely different design. So you could have a style sheet which targets particular devices. And note how we haven't actually had to change the content at all. We simply changed the style sheet. We change the style sheet again, we get a completely different design once more. And that's what's nice about separating out the content from the design. It promotes reuse. We can reuse our content with minimal effort. Now, there have been lots and lots of different versions of cascading style sheets, and the latest version is they're doing incremental modular changes to it. But most of the properties that we'll talk about are standard in whatever version that you're using. And the key is to separate the HTML and the CSS out into separate documents. Just like this. Now, style rules, if you have a look at the CSS document, which is on the right, you can see that these are style rules. And what style rules do is they actually are written in a different style to HTML. And you can see a sort of preview of what they look like in the panel on the right. And what we're actually doing is we're issuing instructions, style the body in this particular way, style the H1 elements in this particular way, style the H2 elements in this particular way. So these are called style rules, and they are written in a different way to HTML. So how do we actually write them out? Well, you write them like this, and we have a selector, and then we use curly brackets, braces, to wrap around a series of property value pairs, which use a colon and a semicolon. So the selector identifies the bit of the page that the style will apply to. And in these simple examples, what we'll be doing is we'll be applying this rule to a particular HTML element. There are other things that you'll do, and you'll see that when we talk about CSS in a bit more detail. But in these examples, we're simply going to be styling some HTML element, like a paragraph or a heading. And then on the right-hand side, we describe how that selector will change, how it will actually be presented. We have this declaration block, and as I've said, we have these curly braces, these brackets, and each one, I like to lay them out on a separate line, and we put a semicolon to separate them out, and then we have a colon in the middle. So let's look at an actual example. Here's a CSS selector for H1s. So what we're going to do is we're going to style the H1 elements on a particular page. Now in here you can see I have two particular properties. I've got the colour and the background colour. Now colour is, if you like, the ink that's being used. Background colour is obviously the colour of the background. And here I'm saying that the H1 element will be using a green pen on a black background. Note the American spelling of colour, by the way. Now if you want to see how that actually works, we have this thing called JS Fiddle. And what's nice about JS Fiddle is it's an external site where you can do prototypes of HTML, CSS, and some JavaScript. We're just going to be using the HTML and the CSS elements. So if you go to that link, it'll bring up this page, and this page shows you three main panels. So if you look traveling around the page clockwise, the first one we have is the HTML. So that's the original HTML code. In a panel next to it on the right is our CSS block, and you can see I've already filled it out with body, H1, H2, and a paragraph. Series of rules that we can apply. They're all empty at the moment, so no style is actually being applied. And then down the bottom, we have a preview of what the page will look like. Now, what's important here is if you look in the top left-hand corner, you can see the Run button. So when we make a change in the CSS, we click Run, and you should see that the panel updates. So if you bring that up, you can try that out. And the first thing we can do is we can try that example that we just had, which was, and here it is at the top of the page, colour, green, background colour, black. And I'm going to put that into the H1 rule. So let's update it and click Run. And there you are, you can see that the H1 element on the web page has got a black background and with green writing on top. Now, as I've indicated, white space and line returns are ignored, so you can lay them out looking like this, but I prefer to lay them out with one rule on each line because I just think it makes it easier to read. Remember to put a semicolon at the end of each one. The basic rules that I'm going to look at, the basic CSS that I'm going to look at later, are these ones. So we're going to have a look at two that we've already looked at, background color and color, and then we'll talk a bit about font families, about font sizes, and about aligning text.